Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree being nominated for Game of the Year presents a handful of problems for the Game Awards. And this is not about whether or not Erdtree deserves awards, okay? It is obviously deserving of praise and accolades. There is no denying that. My goal here is not to take away from Elden Ring or the expansion. It is the second highest rated piece of content on OpenCritic for the entire year, and it was extremely large for an expansion. But the way the nomination happened is just not sitting well with a lot of people in the gaming community, myself included. They sort of changed the website just a few days before, suddenly saying, oh yeah, DLC could be nominated for Game of the Year. Just last year, we were debating whether or not remakes should even be considered in contention for Game of the Year. And the way this type of content was treated in the past makes this just sort of seem wrong. And I think there are three big problems with this. First, there is a category problem. Second, there is a content problem. And lastly, there's a precedent problem. And ultimately, I want to offer a solution because I do think Shadow of the Erdtree should be properly praised and awarded, but I don't think this is the way to do it. Now, I try to do opinion pieces like this along with a daily interactive live stream where I cover gaming news. So if you like this kind of content, be sure to hit like and subscribe. Now, when it comes to the category problem, it seems pretty obvious. Games should be in contention for Game of the Year, not expansions or DLCs. But rather than just state the obvious, let me try to demonstrate this and why it is an issue. First, this is an issue of consistency. Just last year, Phantom Liberty dropped as a completely standalone expansion to Cyberpunk. You didn't have to play a single minute of Cyberpunk to enjoy it. It featured roughly 3 hours of movie-quality cutscenes, an extremely creative story, professional actors and voice actors. It also had its own separate area from the rest of the main game of Cyberpunk. It came with complete overhauls of the game and a free update to the base game that really changed the experience. So it really felt like its own game and its own experience. And yet, last year, it was nominated for Best Ongoing Game. And even that was debated. Games like No Man's Sky and Destiny, they invest a lot of energy into their ongoing content models, and CD Projekt Red deserves credit. They did a ton of great work to the game of Cyberpunk. They added free content. In the years leading up to Phantom Liberty, they had done so much work to the base game. But Cyberpunk is not a game that you would really classify as an ongoing game. Regardless of what you think about that debate, it was clear that the expansion was so large, so transformative, and so standalone that it deserved some type of an award. Now, if you compare this to Shadow of the Erdtree, it becomes quickly obvious that Erdtree doesn't deserve to be in the Game of the Year category any more than Phantom Liberty did. Their approaches are pretty similar. So all this does is create confusion, because all this nomination is doing is clouding the waters, because in just 1 year's time, we're completely changing the rules of what can get nominated and where content like this should land. And the truth is, this will take away from the praise that the expansion deserves. It's far better to be praised for what it is rather than being praised for what it isn't. It's a brilliant expansion. It's a great model for showing just how much you can invest in your game and how much you can give the consumer. It should be praised for being that. Praising it or rewarding it for being a game isn't just categorically and linguistically destructive, it's just confusing, and it almost devalues what it achieved because you're labeling it as something that it's not. And that's not the only problem that this award nomination presents. Now, if the category problem isn't enough to convince you, then maybe the content problem will. We already looked at how Phantom Liberty approached its expansion, and if you look at how Erdtree content is structured, it is handled very differently when you compare it to Phantom Liberty. You could actually argue that Erdtree deserves to be in the Game of the Year category even less. So why do I think that? Well, for starters, the content is super inaccessible as an expansion. You have to play a significant amount of the game from 2 years ago. You have to fight and beat a boss that over half of the Elden Ring community has not defeated, and even getting to that boss is not a simple process. It's pretty elaborate, and a lot of players just have to use a guide to even get to Moog. This makes the Erdtree expansion very much not a standalone experience. It is a dependent and interwoven experience with the base game, so arguing it's a game gets even harder when you look at the content structure. The second problem with the content here is, comparatively, It is almost exactly the same length as Phantom Liberty. Now, everybody's been exaggerating the size of Erdtree because they want it to get nominated. Phantom Liberty, if you just do the story missions, is about 18 to 22 hours. If you do the story and some side content, it's around 22 to 30, and if you go completionist, it's well over 30 hours. I myself did Phantom Liberty in about 25 hours, and that's a pretty good amount of time. So what about Erdtree? If you focus on the main path in Erdtree, it's about 25 hours. If you go completionist, full exploration, it can be around 50. So there's not a significant difference here. The main focus, the main story, the main content is around the exact same length of time that I got out of Phantom Liberty, unless you go full completionist, but that's debatable. Open worlds can be experienced very different ways, and there's just a lot more traversal and time spent walking around and exploring in Erdtree compared to how Phantom Liberty is built. Now, you might push back and you could say, okay, but Phantom Liberty only got an 89 when you look at both of its aggregate scores, and Erdtree's in the mid-90s. Okay, that's fair pushback, but all that would mean, given my opening premise, is that Erdtree would just be the front runner for ongoing game. You'd have to argue more than just the score. You would have to argue the category or the content to justify why Erdtree is in the Game of the Year running and Phantom Liberty wasn't. When you compare both of these expansions from a category perspective and a content perspective, it's very clear there's been some sort of an exception made for Erdtree without justification. But let's just say that you're right and I'm wrong. Well, that presents a whole new problem. This is what I call the precedent problem, and we have a very easy example for how this could play out in the future. 2025 is very likely going to be a year dominated by GTA 6 in numerous ways. Grand Theft Auto 6 will probably break sales records, player engagement records, and it's very likely going to be a frontrunner for Game of the Year, given Rockstar's history, as well as just the prestige of this game. If it's anything close to what we've seen in the trailers, it will likely be an award-winning game. So let's just imagine that it takes the Game Awards by storm in a similar way that Elden Ring did. Do we really want these gargantuan games to win Game of the Year and then be in a position to just sort of perch on the Game of the Year podium year after year? Just push out a 20 to 30 hour expansion at the same quality of your base game, and you're practically a shoo-in. That's the precedent set by giving Erdtree the nomination and the potential win. This also furthers the sense that the only games that matter and get lots of praise are these big, massive budget, high sales volume games. It's great seeing games like Balatro up on the stage, along with a really good variety of games in the Game of the Year category. Astrobot's up there along with Metaphor. But seeing games like Prince of Persia and The Lost Crown, which has over 180 reviews on OpenCritic and it maintained an 87, seeing a game like that brushed to the side so a monolithic games expansion can take a spot, that just feels backwards. In just 1 year's time, we went from debating whether or not remakes should be up on the stage for Game of the Year to nominating an expansion for Game of the Year. An expansion, mind you, that I've already demonstrated is not any larger than Phantom Liberty in play length, and it's far more interwoven and attached to the main game of Elden Ring. Now, this could leave only one potential final pushback. You might say, listen, the industry's changing. Game-sized expansion should be given the opportunity to be praised and recognized for their achievements. And you're right. Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree certainly proves that the industry is changing. Historically, seeing something the size of Erdtree land as an expansion is somewhat anomalous. The same could be said for Phantom Liberty. There are big-budget single-player games that are shorter than these expansions. But if we accept the premise that the industry is changing, then the easiest and simplest solution is to change with the industry. Rather than ham-fist the rare expansion into the Game of the Year category simply because it hits a big size, why not create a category for exceptional additive content? This could be broad enough to include things like what Hello Games continues to do with the big changes and updates they bring to No Man's Sky, but it would also be the perfect spot for content like Erdtree and Phantom Liberty. Content that displays a high level of excellence both in design and size could be awarded every year, because some have said there's not enough DLCs every year to have a DLC category, And I tend to agree. It would be like making a category for remakes or remasters. Sometimes you only have 2 or 3, and then they would just get all the nominations. And we can't just keep adding categories for everything. But I do think indie games demonstrate the point that I'm trying to make. The rise of impressive and award-worthy indie games has been great to see in the gaming world, and because of that, they have 2 categories, Best Indie Game, but also Best Debut Indie Game. We've also have categories like Games for Impact and Best Innovation in Accessibility. I really think something like Best Additive Content could be broad enough to include things like we've seen in No Man's Sky, but also allow expansions like Phantom Liberty and Shadow of the Erdtree a chance to shine. Because, as I said before, Erdtree should be praised and awarded for what it is, not what it isn't. But those are just my thoughts, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in a comment below. Also, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you can be here for those live shows. A lot of the times, if you're a member, there's even more live shows as well. And as always, if you like this kind of content, be sure to hit like, share, and subscribe.